All right, hi everybody. This is my first time doing a video like this, so bear with me. We are going to do a video on the respiratory system. Obviously, this is a review because especially this beginning part has to do with the circulatory system. If we mention the respiratory system, we have to bring up the circulatory system. While I am drawing this heart, I am going to apologize now because I promise you at some point during this video, my family who is home with me for 2 weeks is going to interrupt me at some point or yell in the background or something. So back to the heart. You see I drew the heart and the vessels that go to the body and then that goes up to the lungs. Now remember, and I'm going to draw the lungs up here. And this again is just a review. These are going to be the cells down below. So as you remember, in the atmosphere, there are a whole bunch of different gases that are in the atmosphere, such as nitrogen and water, but in addition to that, there are oxygen molecules. The oxygen molecules go into the lungs, and then from there goes into the blood vessels. The oxygen then transfers down and follows into the heart, which then pumps it out throughout the body. Pumps, keeps going, still going. And then once it gets to the bottom, then it transfers into the cell tissues. And then CO2 comes out and goes back into the blood. And CO2 then has to go out through that same transport system back to the heart, which you guys better all remember this. Back to the heart, and then pumps out the heart on that right side and then goes up to the lungs. The CO2 then leaves the lungs back into the atmosphere, and CO2 is all in the atmosphere. And what's great is that we have plants in this world which take in carbon dioxide and create and make oxygen. So the cycle continues round and round. The important part is the respiratory system has 4 sections. The first is pulmonary ventilation. That's when the oxygen goes into the lungs. Movement of air in and out of the lungs. The second section is external respiration. That is the movement of oxygen from the lungs into the blood. And then also the carbon dioxide from the blood into the lungs. The third we've talked about for months now is the transport. That's when those respiratory gases such as oxygen connect to the red blood cells and transport to the cells. The fourth part is internal respiration, which is movement of oxygen from the blood to the tissues, and then carbon dioxide from the tissues to the blood. So as you can see, respiration is not just oxygen going in and out of the lungs. It's pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, transport, and then internal respiration. All right, so let's review anatomy here now. All right. So first we're going to talk about the cavities. This top area is the nasal cavity, which is also the nasopharynx. This is the oral cavity. Over here is the larynx, and this is the trachea. Now this red little flap of skin over here, this is the epiglottis. That is very important because that covers the trachea when someone eats, so that way it will go down the esophagus, which is the tube right next to it. So that way no food goes into the trachea and then down into the lungs, which I am drawing right now. That's the right lung, and that's the left lung. The right lung, which we're going to go into more, has 3 lobes. Left lung has 2. And this big base of the lungs is the diaphragm. Okay, so if we look into the lungs specifically, more details, as we always do. Right now, I am drawing the trachea and the tube and the bronchus, which you'll see. It all come together in a second. All right, and this is the left lung. You'll understand why I'm doing that in a minute. Okay, so just to remember, that is the trachea. That's where oxygen comes down. That area where I just pointed to, that's called the carina. This is the primary bronchi. The primary bronchi then breaks off to the secondary bronchi, which then breaks off to the tertiary bronchi, which then breaks off to the bronchioles. And then you have the alveolar sacs, which contains each alveoli. And we're going to go into details of what that looks like later on. So this is the importance of how it goes from the trachea, going from the atmosphere down to the alveoli. So this is the right lung, and this is the left lung. Here is the superior lobe. Here is the superior lobe. They both have one. This is the inferior lobe, which makes sense because it's at the bottom, and also the inferior lobe. Now there's 2 main areas. This is the middle lobe, which is only on the right lung. This is the cardiac notch, and this is on the left side, so it's on the left lung, because this whole area here is where the heart goes. So the heart goes here. It's not really drawn to scale. Honestly, it would be a little bit bigger, but for our purposes, it's fine. Now, there's a whole bunch of little alveoli in there. If we're going to talk about alveoli, we're going to go into a little bit more detail with those. So this is going to be an alveolar sac that I'm going to be drawing. The only reason why that one looks different is just to show you in detail. So this is the bronchiole. Remember, CO2 comes out, and O2, I wrote that backwards. You're going to have to ignore that. Oxygen goes in and CO2 goes out. So I'm sorry, that's the alveolar sac, and one of those is an alveoli. Okay, so you've seen these things before. You squish it all up. This looks like, the whole thing looks like an alveolar sac, the whole thing. But an alveoli is just one of those little squishy beads. So if we look at really closely at one alveoli, that's this right here, one alveoli. There's an artery and a vein that's attached to each one. So this is the pulmonary artery, which is really capillary, but pulmonary artery that goes to the heart, which is why it's in blue, and it's an artery, but it's deoxygenated and why it's in blue. Ignore my daughter. Even watching this is kind of cracking me up. I tried really hard. They're off for school for 2 weeks, so my videos seriously might have her in it a lot. I'm sorry. Okay, focus. So this is the pulmonary vein. It goes away from the heart, which is why it's called a vein. However, it's oxygenated, which is why I drew it in red. Okay, so if we're looking super, okay, baby girl. If we're looking super close, these are all the cells that surround the alveoli. And if you remember right, they were type 1 cells and type 2 cells. The type 2 cells secreted the surfactant. I told my daughter that she could draw an O2, and there you go. Okay, so these are the type 1 cells which surround the alveoli. And this is the capillary. Okay, so then the oxygen goes into the capillaries and it binds to the hemoglobin and travels throughout the body. And here are the little red blood cells, and it travels through, and CO2 goes back out that way. You should actually hear the giggles from the original video. It's actually pretty funny. Okay. Now that we said all of that, what's the point? So how does it all work? What are the mechanisms of breathing? Because moving oxygen from the atmosphere into your body is great and all, but it doesn't help if you don't understand how you're going to breathe. So remember, that's the trachea. Here are the lungs. I'm leaving this space in there for the time being. This is just kind of a reminder. Here's right lung, left lung. That little sac around each of the lung is the pleural cavity with the serous fluid. Whenever you see that C with a line, it means with, just so you know. Visceral pleura is connecting against the chest wall, and the parietal pleura is touching the organ itself. And then there's serous fluid in between. Okay, so when we talk about breathing, we have to talk about the ribs. That's what these little itty bitty things are. They're going to be the ribs. I know there's a lot more than 5, however, for my purposes, we're just going to say ribs. In between the ribs, where the green is, are intercostal muscles. And they are very important to deal with breathing, in addition to the big diaphragm down below. Those 2 muscles are the muscles used for breathing. The lungs itself are not a muscle. They can't move independently on its own. The diaphragm and the intercostal muscles move, causing the lungs to inflate or deflate. Okay. Inspiration, expiration. You know, I have pictures for everything. So, inspiration, the diaphragm goes from up there and it contracts to further down. The diaphragm lowers, which is contraction. It expands the rib cage. It opens the lungs by changing the pulmonary pressure. Thus forcing air into the lungs. There you go. Now, with expiration, the exact opposite happens. The diaphragm starts up, down low, and then relaxes, which causes it to elevate. That causes the rib cage to contract, thus contracting the lungs and pushing the air completely out. So here the lungs are essentially contracting and air is going out. So I made this beautiful little tube, okay, out of a water bottle and balloons. This blue part is the diaphragm, and the red is the lungs. When you pull the diaphragm down, the lungs inflate. I moved it in different directions because I couldn't tell where you could see it or not. So if you decide you want to do this for your video for extra credit later on, which you might have seen about, might not, it's really easy. You just need a half a water bottle and 2 balloons that you would just cut. If you ever want to you Google balloon lungs, you'll find it. It's really, really easy. Okay, so next is lung function and spirometry. This you have not done yet. And this can be a little confusing. So hopefully I will explain it in a way that you understand. If I don't, please email me or anything and let me know, and I can possibly tell you in a different way so you can understand a little bit more. So this little circle here is an alveoli. Oxygen goes in and carbon dioxide goes out. This is what we breathe normally, called the tidal volume. That's what you're doing right now, breathing normal. Okay, that amount is just a normal amount of breathing, not or exhaling, just normal. Now, if you take a deep breath inhale, like what kids want to do when they are in the pool or wanting to hold their breath for a long time. The alveoli still has the tidal volume that you normally breathe. However, that deep inspiration causes that alveoli to expand a little bit, and that expansion has this inspiratory reserve volume. So that's the amount of air that's between the tidal volume and how much it can possibly expand. Now, talking about deep expiration, this is the tidal volume. This is how much you could possibly breathe in. That's how much it can expand. But you can also breathe out forcefully. So this area here, where I'm about to shade, is the expiratory reserve volume. That's the amount of volume that you can forcefully exhale. Imagine blowing out 100 candles. Now you see there's this little area left in green. That is the residual volume. That's air that just stays there. It never really goes away. So you always have a little bit of air in your lungs. Okay, now to make this even more confusing, I'm going to turn this into a graph to confuse you further. My goal in life. All right, so 6 liters, 5 liters, 4 liters, 3 liters, 2 liters, 1 liter of air. So this is the lung volume. So the higher it goes is inspiration, and the lower it goes is expiration. This is just so I have a baseline. Okay, so when I'm breathing in normal tidal volume, that's what it looks like. Normal breathing. If I want to take a deep breath in, it goes all the way up and then exhales and then back down to normal tidal volume. So this volume right here is the inspiratory reserve. Now I'm back to tidal volume and I exhale a whole lot. That's that exhale. By the way, this is the tidal volume, just so you have it on your paper. However, this right here, what I exhaled, that's the inspiratory reserve, is the expiratory reserve because I took a normal breath and I blew out all of my 100 candles. This area below is the residual volume. That's that volume that always stays. You think that that's enough. However, it's not. There's a whole bunch of other different technical terms. First one is functional capacity. This is the expiratory reserve volume plus the residual volume. That basically means it's the air in our lungs at rest. Okay, then there's inspiratory capacity. Which is the inspiratory reserve plus the tidal volume. And that basically means it's the air that we can potentially breathe in. So that would be your inspiratory reserve volume plus what you normally breathe. Now, for vital capacity, that is the inspiratory, inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. Okay, that is all the air that we use in the lungs. And then total lung capacity is all of it. Inspiratory reserve volume plus tidal volume plus expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume is all the air in the lungs. There's a lot of different terms that can be confusing because one is called inspiratory capacity, one's called inspiratory reserve, one's functional capacity, one's inspiratory capacity. It can be very confusing. Look at this thoroughly, know it in detail. All right. All right, so forgive me, I'm going to talk really, really fast because my video did not really take the way I wanted it to. So I'm going to talk fast to catch you up. Lung pathology, there's a few different types. There's circulatory pathology, which can be a pulmonary embolism, which would be a clot, pulmonary hypertension, or vasculitis, which would be an infection. All of those would not be able to accept oxygen into the blood. Okay, next, infectious. You want to think swelling and snot. It's not really snot, it's mucus, but these are my pretty little lungs in all the different areas. So what happens with the swelling is the walls become swollen, and then there's snot inside. So first place, trachea, tracheitis. Second place, bronchioles, or bronchitis, or bronchi. The third place is pneumonia, which would be the alveoli. So the alveolar sac gets thickened, and then there's mucus inside. So not only do they all have inability to get oxygen, but they're also coughing up all kinds of stuff. So there's malignancy as well. There can be bronchial cancer or alveolar cancer or metastases from any other types of cancer. Those are the three main, at least, things we're going to talk about. But what we really want to focus on is restrictive versus obstructive lung disease. Obstructive is when they say the patient says they can't get the air out. They're trying to exhale and they just can't. So there's only a few types. Let's say asthma. This is a normal bronchial wall. The bronchial wall becomes inflamed, as you can see from the blue marker. There's a little bit of mucus that comes inside, but with the wall tightening up, it's harder to get air to those alveoli to get the gas transfer. COPD actually has two different diseases inside. One of it is chronic bronchitis. That's when there is wall inflammation and mucus. So you see the same wall inflammation, and then there's junk inside. That's that smoker's cough that you hear when grandma wakes up in the morning after smoking 50 years. Chronic bronchitis. Emphysema is a little different. This is a normal alveolar sac. There's lots of little alveoli inside. That is a good source of surface area. So here's all the little alveoli. And now with emphysema, that essentially breaks. So instead of looking like this, it looks like that. So there's less surface area, so there's less capillaries that can pass by than with that. So that means less oxygen can get in. So they're trying to take a deep breath and they're trying to exhale, but they can't exhale because that residual volume that's in their lungs is still so large. So there's less surface area, so less oxygen transfer. Okay, next is bronchiectasis. Just like with emphysema, how the alveolar wall gets broken down, with bronchiectasis, the bronchial wall becomes damaged. The wall becomes inflamed, it becomes enlarged, and mucus is formed. Bronchiolitis is just like bronchitis, but with the bronchioles instead of the bronchus. And it's also a result of RSV. Restrictive disease is when they can't get the air in. So instead of being able to take deep, deep breaths, they almost feel like they have a straitjacket on and they can't inhale all the way. So they can't get air in. So there are hundreds of restrictive diseases. Anything with the end of osis, fibrosis, silicosis, pneumosiliosis, you don't need to know about that. That's when alveoli become fibrotic, and that means the lungs can't expand because the walls become sturdy and fibrotic, so they can't exhale to that inspiratory reserve. Another possibility is pleural disease. So we looked at this pleural cavity here. If that becomes really inflamed, the lung can't expand. So I drew it again over here just to show you exactly. Okay, the next is chest wall abnormalities. In a second. There you go. Such as obesity or extreme kyphosis. Um, give it a second. Kyphosis is when there's a big spinal curve and there's just the mechanisms of the way the body is built. They physically just can't take a big deep breath. And the last thing is neurological issues. And we're not going to really delve into that because that can be a ton. So this is the main lung pathology.